You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Coaching Inn. I'm your host, Claire Pedrick, and today I'm in conversation with Derek Hill, who sent me a message and said, do you want to talk about endings? Well, given that endings are the thing that probably comes up more in supervision than anything else, and given that our coach mentors say that endings are often the thing that people really need to focus on, of course I said yes, Derek.
Wow.
Welcome to the Coaching Inn.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Great to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about endings.
So before we talk about endings, let's talk about beginnings. Tell us a little bit about your coaching journey.
Okay, so my coaching journey, I had lived a life in kind of corporate, leading organizations, and I had just a fascination, or I recognized that the success of my organization was based on the people within it and how they kind of showed up and how they were supported to have great days at work. So it really sparked a curiosity in the world of coaching and how I use that to support people better. And that one thing led to another. I got a bit of imposter syndrome, thought I had to do a bit more education in coaching, learned more about it. And like many people, found a real love in it and thought this is something that I really want to focus my time and effort on. So I invested some time and money in Henley Business School, went through their programs there, did the MSc. Really enjoyed that experience. It was fantastic. And then I set up my own coaching practice, been running that for a few years, High Five Coaching. And now I'm actually a coach with HSBC. So enjoying that experience as well.
Wow, that's probably a different podcast. Because I don't want to go down that route. Because, of course, lots of coaches say, how do I get an employed job that's got coach in the name? But that's not for now.
Okay.
Well, it could be, but let's see. So what piqued your interest in endings?
Yeah, so maybe there's something about endings in that story, actually, because I think I can remember sitting in a workshop once with John Whittington of kind of Constellations fame. And he was talking about systems, and he was talking about the physical systems and also what goes on in systems that we don't see. And particularly what grasped my attention was this concept of joining and belonging and leaving. Yeah. And the leaving I kind of equated to ending. And I think when I talk about my transition, I was noticing, there's a few endings and beginnings going on in my world. And I wondered, how they transferred to the coaching space, and how they transferred to my relationships with coachees or the way I coached or how that kind of thing. And I thought, endings particularly, I think are very kind of powerful. And I'm sure something goes on there unconsciously with endings. And I was just kind of curious to kind of think about that a little bit more and look at it closely.
I was also in that classroom, not at the same time as you. And as you speak, there's something about an appropriate disconnecting, isn't there? So that we become very connected, and then when we get to the ending, we need to take what's useful with us and leave the rest behind. And that's, I think, isn't it, where it often falls over.
No, I love that. I love that thought. I think whilst I say there's a power in ending, there's a power in all elements, and there's a real power in belonging. And one of the things I thought about and kind of challenged myself was, as I moved from, a leader, a manager of people to a coach, was I replacing that relationship I had with my team members with the relationship I now had with my coachees? Yeah. So then when it came to the end of the relationship, that would feel very different, because we don't necessarily do that typically at work. We don't work with our colleague for a bit and then we part ways. That happens in some ways, but not on as frequent a basis as perhaps in coaching. So I wondered, am I doing anything at the end? Is there any kind of attachment there? Am I doing anything? Are they doing anything? You know, what's happening?
So in your wondering, what did you find out?
So in my wondering, and I did my final research project on my MSc about endings, and one of the things there was looking at the research and looking what's around, and I recognised there's not that much on endings. So there is some research. Elaine Cox had written a great paper back, I think, 2010, 2012. And Catherine Sadler had written some nice stuff in her book, Psychodynamic Coaching. But apart from that, there was quite little, and most about endings were in the kind of therapeutic space. And even when I looked at the industry bodies like ICF, endings were mentioned very lightly, like honouring the end, in the competency.
In one line.
Yeah, in one line. So, and it seems such a big thing, and you know what, and that sounds good, honoring the end. Yeah, that sounds a good wordy thing. But then it's like, what does that actually mean? And I didn't know what it meant. And I thought maybe because endings are difficult, we kind of avoid them on a systemic level as well. Yeah. And I wondered about that. I wondered about that balance of beginnings and endings. I noticed that some of our tools and stuff that we use, even like the wonderful Stokers, is at the front of our conversations, and we use that Covey, start with the end in mind.
I've got one for the end, don't you worry.
I'm sure you have.
But what you were describing there sounds like the end of the relationship. But there's also, isn't there, the end of the conversation? And I wonder whether we avoid the end of the conversation, maybe as much as we avoid the end of the relationship. And I just wonder if they're connected.
Yeah, no, I think that might be present. I think my research was very much focused on the coach's experience of ending the client relationship.
Yeah.
So in what I had read in the research, there was some work on the coachee's experience in ending the client relationship and what might show up for the coachee. Like, one interesting thing I read in the research was that final session is the hardest one to schedule and is the most likely to be cancelled and rearranged, and sometimes never happens, because of how we kind of cope with endings differently. So what I was interested in was exploring from the coach's perspective how they end well in order to end that relationship well for the benefit of them and the coachee, but also for their future coaching practice. So we go on and feel like we have efficacy as a coach.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's complex, isn't it? Because sometimes if you're in a commissioned piece of work over a number of sessions, sometimes the good work finishes before the end. So that also, doesn't it, impacts whether you go for that end session. But if you don't go for that end session, you didn't end when the work ended because you didn't know the work had ended when the work ended until after.
Yeah, absolutely. And I spoke with...
That wasn't a simple sentence.
No, I'll have to sit with that and listen to it back. I sat with lots of coaches through this research and talked about their experience of endings. And there was a real mix of descriptive words and emotions. And, on the positive side, there was a lot of pride and celebration at the end of the process. The feeling that a job well done, that kind of positive feedback, making a difference, that warm feeling in their heart that this is purposeful work and worthy work. But then on the counter side, and it was interesting, there were some real stark words, like the word grief came up a lot in the interviews, to say the sense of loss, the sense of, not knowing. And that was interesting around, like, how do I contract for after the end was a kind of unanswered point. A lot of coaches stalking their coachees on LinkedIn to find out how things have gone, So yeah, it was an interesting point, that kind of that mix of emotions we have as a coach. And one thing, you've sparked there is I talked to people who didn't end their kind of program of sessions and how that felt, when they were really connected and enjoying the partnership and the work and feeling like they were at the kind of learning edge as a coach in this partnership. And then suddenly at the end of one session, the coach, he would say, I think I've got enough now. And it was, and I thought, what coach, he was like, coach who was like, gosh, you know, that was hard to hear, you know, that the work was done.
As you're talking, I've gone back to the beginning, of course, because there's a natural shift there, isn't there? But, you know, if we're there to build trust and rapport and intimacy,
yeah,
then of course there's going to be grief.
Yeah.
Except, sorry, I'm probably going off on either on stuff you've already thought about or on a completely parallel track. Is it okay if I?
Yeah.
So the question that comes up for me is, what kind of intimacy does intimacy need to be like? Because if you have intimacy in a personal relationship that then has grief if and when the relationship is over, that kind of comes with the territory or not. But the intimacy that we have in coaching, I wonder whether sometimes there's over intimacy.
Gosh, I think that's a really interesting point. I think in some of the reading I did, I came across this phrase of good enough endings.
Yeah.
And the point there was to recognize that endings will be clunky. Endings are tough. Yeah. Endings aren't perfect. So therefore we need to be okay with that imperfection of endings and do what's kind of good enough in that kind of moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's never going to be perfect.
Yeah. And I think also you sparked me to think about one thing that came up was about what else is going on in our life, both currently and in our lived experience, that informs or influences how we end as a coach. There was one coach I interviewed who'd had some separation in their life in terms of parental relationships. And that meant they had a very different view of kind of endings and attachment. And they actually didn't find endings any problem at all. Yeah. Endings were just something that happened in life. But it felt like there was, you know, it wasn't the scope of this study, but it felt like there was something very deep in there in the kind of childhood story that kind of maybe kind of influenced how that showed up. And I wonder how when we train as coaches, how much we think about, you know, what we bring, you know, with us and how that's going to influence us as a coach.
Yeah. You and I need to have another conversation. This podcast is about endings. And I'm just thinking, oh, well, they could go right over there. So coming back to the point of endings, what were your biggest learnings?
So number one biggest learning was a little bit, I mentioned that Stephen Covey kind of quote at the start, you know, we begin with the end in mind. And that's used a lot, and we set ourselves up. And if we think of some of the questions we ask in coaching, you know, what will be different at the end of our time? You know, what will change? Well, how will you know? You know, what will it? You know, we're very focused on that. But if we think about the balance, you know, we have kind of chemistry sessions and discovery sessions kind of scheduled. But I don't mean many coaches that have an ending session or a closing session scheduled. Yeah, and when I spoke to coaches, I often found that they just try to cram the ending in at the last 10, 15 minutes of the final session, you know, just to recognize that this is the last session and, you know, what might we need to say to each other to honor the ending. And maybe that was in service of the coachee because, you know, there was a contractual thing there. It was their time, you know, what's best for us to talk about. And I wonder if in terms of learning on both sides, there's more of a supported ending that can be a helpful process.
And if I can riff off that, when does that need to happen, and when does that need to be talked about? Because you've said 2 or 3 times about Covey saying begin with the end in mind.
Yeah.
You go, well, we'll have a chemistry session and then we'll do the work. what coach says, and then we'll have and then after the work is finished, we'll have an ending conversation.
Yeah. And maybe there's a contracting for that.
Yeah.
And then a way to, capture the learning and like a structured reflection about the process. Because there's another great quote that I like by Seligman in his Authentic Happiness book, which is like, he says, in your own life, you should take particular care with endings, for their color will forever tinge your memory of the entire relationship. And so I think, that last session is a really important session.
So when is it? Who's it for, and who pays for it?
Yeah, who's it for is a very interesting point.
And I think for me, what I notice when I talk to coaches is that often the end session becomes a "how was I?"
Yeah.
And there's a confusion, isn't there, between feedback and reflection, feedback to the coach and reflection for the thinker. And what are we both learning about relationships?
Yeah, what are we both learning? I think that's a really interesting point. Capturing the opportunities, capturing the things that have surprised us about ourselves and about the conversations that we've had.
Yeah. I got my clarity about the pre-conversation that's in Simplifying Coaching from listening to a recording. When you kind of know something and then something happens and you really know it. It was that day.
Yeah.
And I was listening to a recording and it was the final session. And that rarely happens. When coaches bring recordings for a technical check-in with me, they rarely bring the final session. But this person brought the final session. And of course, the coach was recording it so that I could listen to it. So they really wanted to demonstrate the beginning so that in the recording, I would hear that they were doing a good shape to the conversation. So that the coach is doing something like, what would you like to think about today? And the thinker's going, do you know, this has been the most useful working relationship I've ever had. And then the coach is going, so what would you like to be different by the end of the session? And as I was listening to this recording with this coach, who I can't remember who it was, I was almost screaming at them going, they're trying to give you really good feedback that you haven't asked for, and you're not listening because you're trying to shape the session for me.
Yeah.
This is a real session, but it'd be really interesting, wouldn't it, to dig into listening to recordings of final sessions and noticing what else is happening.
Yeah. Interesting to capture those things we put down, those things we think about after that session's ended.
So you got these mixed words and you got some really mixed experiences. What else did you notice in your research?
So what else did I notice? I noticed there was this thing, and Elaine Cox talks about in her work about the end and the ending. And then also I think my research showed that kind of thing of, what happens after the ending. Because we talk about an ending, but is it really an ending? And sometimes, in the, conditioned learning of kind of coaching competencies, we kind of think that, we don't want them to be dependent on us, so therefore we need to kind of pull back from the relationship. But maybe that dependency's, maybe that dependency's not there for them, and they just enjoy that relationship, and that's you're kind of part of that. And so I wonder, that's a learning for me is this, like, how do we end in terms of going forward? What's the contract? Yeah. Do we, is this it? Do we never talk again? Or do we check in? Is that helpful? How will it work?
And who's checking in? Is it the coach who's checking in, or is it the human who's now in a slightly different relationship with the person?
That's an interesting question. I think in my research, it was definitely the coach who was checking in, because maybe the need being fulfilled was that not knowing and perhaps seeing. But then I think about your phrase earlier of the "how am I doing?" because that's like a future "how am I doing?" or how sticky has that work kind of been?
If you take the question, would we ever go out for lunch? That's a post-ending thing. And I've been in supervision groups with coaches, quite a lot of coaches who go the end is the end is the end.
Yeah.
And then others where they become friends with the person that they were formerly coaching. So I think there's a question, and for me, there's a question about, is it an end or is it a transition? And if it's a transition, what are we transitioning to?
Yeah.
And is that clear enough? And who pays for lunch?
Both of these?
And who pays for the lunch?
Who pays for lunch? I love that.
Well, I think, seriously though, I think that gives some clarity.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's interesting. And it's having a common understanding of that position as well, not thinking from within. I work with one coach coach who I was interviewing. He's a very experienced coach, been coaching for many, many years. And she shared with me that she struggles with endings. And one of her coping mechanisms is she never holds the final session. So she always tells the coachee there's one more session for them to hold when they need it. Like this kind of offering that they can always come back for this final session should they ever need it. And she says that gives her some comfort in the final session. But she recognized that, is that helpful or not helpful? She wasn't sure.
Well, that's interesting because I sometimes do that. And in my head, I call that a lifeline, because it's when the work's finished, but they don't think it's finished. To say to them, well, there's one more session that's paid for that you can take at any point in the future. I'm really pretty confident they're not going to take it, but also they've got the confidence of having it there if they need it, which they probably don't. So there's something there on both sides, isn't there?
Absolutely. And maybe you spark me. Go on, sorry. No,
you keep going because this is so interesting.
Well, you just sparked me there to remember a piece that I reflected on in my work was about, you talked there about this kind of, agreeing what the end looks like and, who pays for lunch. So there's a common understanding. But also, I guess we have to recognize in coaching that it's kind of like our end as a coach. The program's ending and it's ending for us. But if you actually look at the position of the coachee, it's probably their beginning. They were ending at the start of the relationship. When they came to coaching, they may have said, I want change. Enough's enough. I've ended my relationship with the status quo. Yeah. And I'm going to do this work with this new partner. Yeah. So they're kind of ending, we're beginning. And then at the end, maybe what makes it clunky is this misalignment. It's ending for us. So we think it's ending for them. But actually what they're saying is, no, I've got everything I need to begin now.
I've gone off on another tangent. Am I allowed to share it?
Absolutely.
So I'm thinking about intimacy and belonging, and I'm thinking that people are different, aren't they? So I have quite a number of really close friends.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, most of them know each other. They're in different places. And I've always got room for another. I've always, if I meet someone else who I really connect with, there's always room for someone else.
Yeah.
There are other people at the other extreme. There are people who've had one, they have one really good friend and that's their really good friend and that's their only really good friend. And that's also marvelous. But there's something, isn't there, about the person who's come for coaching and the coach in terms of our relationship and what we believe about how squishy the edges are of our tribe of people, of human people. So if somebody who has lots of connected relationships, somebody that you've coached might enter into that quite comfortably over time.
Yeah.
But somebody who only has one close relationship, for them to embrace somebody who they've coached into that very small space is going to look, feel, and be experienced in a very different way.
No, I think that's a great observation. I think there's a very kind of, there's a way of thinking very deeply about that in terms of, emotions and relationships and, how we connect as human beings. And then there's also a very top level way of looking at it, of saying like, when we're a coach and it's a commercial transaction, if we've got lots of coachees, it's easier to say goodbye to one than if we are just working with one coachee, and that's kind of our revenue.
But there's also an inequality in the relationship, isn't there? Because we know them much more deeply than they know us.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So yeah, you're making me, maybe there's definitely more work to be done in the world of endings.
There is. So that's two things you said that you learned in your research. So for those of you who are linear, apologies, we are coming back to the line.
Yep.
What else did you learn?
So I learned kind of lots of things, lots of little tips and things that coaches do, particularly in one bit. I liked one coach who was very organized, where this idea of numbering the sessions, of always working towards the end, of being clear, like the coaches who seemed to have a better relationship with endings were the coaches who worked towards the end. The end was part of the coaching. Whereas the coaches who seem to struggle with endings is when they wandered on an exploration and adventure with their coachee, and then the ending was like more of a kind of loss because it was this thing together. So I noticed this directional thing, and this comes back to, really working towards the end. If that's what you want to do as a coach, is not to say that that's the right way. It's just recognize if you take the other route, just endings will be a bit tougher, and that's okay. It's just something you need to be aware of. And then through my work, I did reflections after every kind of interview, and I was kind of keen on, I guess being an engineer from my background, keen on the models in coaching as supportive and how they can be helpful. And one of the things in the gaps in what's out there was, Stokers is a nice model, and at Henley we were taught Douse at the end of the sessions, and there's a nice weight or balance between those, and also Promises was a structure that Karen Foy and Susan Hayes Jones had come up with for the start of relationships, but there was nothing at the end. There was nothing that balanced Promises. So I kind of worked on that and came up with a mnemonic through the work, which was called Goodbyes. And as soon as I found Goodbyes, all my research kind of fitted into Goodbyes, which probably shows my naivety as a researcher. But it felt like the right thing to, or it felt like a nice thing to do, was have a supportive kind of structure that just helps us think about that, both as a coachee and potentially a coach.
So is it written up, your research?
So I haven't published it, but I have written it up as a Henley Insight Guide. So anyone can find it on the kind of Henley Insight Guides. And yeah, I had a wonderful supervisor called Julia Carden who has given me some nice nudges to write it up. And yeah, I've got to get around to doing that part,
because it matters. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because almost everything we've talked about in this conversation has been about the end of the relationship, but there's still the end of the session. And something that you just said about 3 or 4 minutes ago, you said some people kind of meander and some people coach with the end in mind. I think that's also true in each session. Yeah. And I think that the biggest issue about endings for coaches is that the better you are at creating really wonderful and beautiful space, the less the thinker has any idea where you are in the conversation. And they'll just keep, if they're on the journey to deeper, they'll just keep going deeper. And then you won't stop them because you think that's disrespectful. You've now got 5 minutes before the end of the session and you don't know what to do. And then you just cut it off.
Yeah, I love that. Where that question, where are we, coming up all the way through? I don't know why I thought of it, but you reminded me of when you're having a really good dream and you just wake up.
Oh, and you just want to go back to sleep.
I know. And you think, God, that just ended. You can never go back to it. And there's a moment that it feels a bit kind of sad, because you can never have that again. And I wonder if there's I wonder if I'm thinking that with what you've said about coaching, that when we wander, we can get to really nice places. It can feel great in the relationship, but then when it ends, it just ends. Yeah, it
Yeah.
doesn't. It's not structured.
And do you have children?
Yes.
So I don't know how old your children are, but when children are small and you go somewhere, you say to them, you can play with your Lego for 5 more minutes and then we're going to leave. And they know, then they still have a doodah, but they know that actually the end is coming and that they can't play there with whatever it is they're doing forever. But I think we need to do that in every conversation, because otherwise I think that our deep ability to create connection is actually really disrespectful. Because we're waking them up from the dream. Because we have control of when that ends. Well, the clock has control of when that ends, but they're probably not looking.
Yeah. Yeah. You're making me think of the 5 more minutes kind of message from the child.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what happens. But all you do, if you say 5 more minutes, if you give them 5 more extra minutes, then they will always expand the thing to the time available.
Yeah.
Whereas if you say in coaching, if you say, so we've got about 15 minutes left, what do we need to do? That begins to just sow the seed that we're beginning to end the conversation. And actually, that's where transformation happens.
Yeah.
And I wonder if this is just a thought experiment about coaches who meander versus coaches who are very clear about we've got 4 sessions left.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether, in the same way that in an individual session, the transformation often happens after we've begun to name the end. I wonder whether that's true in the relationship.
Yeah, because I think when you talk there, naming the end creates a constraint, and perhaps there's some creativity comes from working within constraints.
Yeah.
It kind of makes us, it makes our mind work a different way.
Mm-hmm. So much to learn, Derek.
Well, I just hope that this kind of conversation has maybe piqued people's interest to think more about endings, because, I do believe that they are as important, if not more important, than the beginning. Yeah. So it might, if you're a coach, I'd love you to notice, how much time do I give to these elements of the relationship? Yeah. And just check in with that and think, I wonder what that might mean.
And if you're interested in the ending, listeners, if you're interested in the ending of a conversation, I'll put a link to a masterclass in the show notes, and you can listen. And if you put in the code Derek, we'll give you a discount. Then you'll remember Derek's name.
Okay. Thank you for that.
So if people want to keep talking about it, Derek, how do they contact you?
Yeah, so I guess easiest thing is just hook up me on LinkedIn, and you can find me through there. I'm actually it hasn't been planned yet, but I think we're doing it in April. I'm an associate at the faculty at Henley Business School, and we're going to do a talk about endings in April. So if anybody's connected with the kind of Henley live community, there'll be some information on there if anybody's interested in getting into a bit deeper discussions about this kind of topic.
And are you up for more talks?
Yeah. No, I think it's when we feel competence may be the wrong word, but when we feel comfortable in our ability to end, I think it can be a good thing for our relationships and our coaching.
Cool. So we have listeners in over 100 countries. So watch out for the invitations.
All right. I look forward to that. And thanks for the conversation today, and thanks for your kind of thinking and contribution.
So now we're both in high anxiety because we've got to demonstrate that we ended this well.
Yeah.
So what do we need to do to end this well, Derek?
Well, I think one point of goodbye, so I won't go through the whole model, but the why is about yearning. So I'm kind of interested in the question maybe for you in this ending. What what are you perhaps yearning for in terms of the topic? What's it sparking for you that's still to be thought about for you?
Shall I send you some money for that? Um, I think the thing that I want to keep thinking about is it has been connected from a few things you've said, which is about our personal experience and attitude. But I'm curious and interested to notice. I think that probably shows up a whole lot more than we think it does.
Yeah.
So when I go later today to listen to a recording for a coach who wants to kind of get a sense of where they are, I should be really noticing that. And then I will also notice it in my own stuff. Because who you are is how you coach.
Yeah.
And who you are in relationship to endings is also how you coach, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's a nice thought to hold on to.
And you're taking away?
I'm taking away that I was thinking at the start of this year about what I want to advocate. I think that's a word we don't use a lot. And, I think this is an important part. And I would like to be a bit more purposeful about advocating endings. So I think I would like to keep this conversation going. And I learn lots in every conversation I have about it. So there's a benefit for me, but I think there's a benefit for all of us. I would love one day for the competencies that we help coaches form their habits with have a little bit more of a leaning towards endings.
Rather than one line.
Yeah.
Actually, the ICF, when I wrote Simplifying Coaching, the ICF were the only professional body who talked about it at all. And it's very clearly in relation to the relationship. But actually it is relation to, it's every single time.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting.
So let's make this a little ending, because I'd love to have you back to talk more.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for today, Claire.
And thank you. And thank you everyone for listening. There's lots of information in the show notes. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, everyone. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching Inn, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.